The storm outside was ferociously intense. The windows trembled with every gust of wind, and the rain poured down like a waterfall, filling the night with its deafening roar. I was about to go to bed, calming myself with the thought that the evening would pass peacefully, but suddenly, a loud, insistent knock echoed through the door. I froze, unsure of who could possibly be out there in such weather. I slowly got up from the chair and approached the door. Through the peephole, I could only see a dark figure. I opened it without thinking. Standing on the doorstep was Danny, my husband Jason's younger brother. He looked as though he had just emerged from a whirlpool, drenched to the skin, with wet hair clinging to his face and a tired but determined expression. He didn't even seem to notice the wind that rushed in through the door and simply stepped inside without waiting for me to invite him. "What's happened?" I asked, trying not to show my unease. Danny had always been a bit odd, but at that moment, his appearance and behavior seemed especially inexplicable to me. He sighed, as if gathering his thoughts, and answered briefly, "Just the rain, nothing special." I mumbled something in response, but didn't press further about the reason for his visit. At times like these, you don't want to ask too many questions. You just let him in, and later you think that maybe it was meant to be. Danny quickly passed me, stopped in the hallway, and looked around as though searching for something. There was something strange in his gaze that I couldn't immediately understand. He didn't look scared or apologetic, but rather as though everything happening around him was part of some other reality. When I tried to ask again if everything was okay, he once again replied curtly, "Yeah, everything's fine, just the rain." His words sounded like an excuse, and I sensed he was hiding something. But I didn't want to get involved. I looked at him once more, at his wet hair, at the droplets of water slowly dripping from his fingers. Perhaps at that moment, I didn't realize how much this visit would change everything in my life, but there was something in his gaze, something that made me keep my distance. Later, when I returned to the living room and was almost forgetting about Danny's strange visit, I heard footsteps on the stairs. It was Jason, my husband. He had come downstairs as if sensing something and froze in the kitchen doorway when he saw us. In an instant, the space in the room seemed to change. I felt it like a solid wall between them. It was almost imperceptible, but so sharp that I was surprised by it myself. Jason had always been a reserved person, but now his face had taken on a shade of alertness, a coldness that I couldn't ignore. His eyes swept over Danny, and even if he hadn't known him for years, I would have definitely noticed how his gaze narrowed. They didn't exchange a word or a gesture, but the invisible wall that suddenly appeared between them was clear to everyone. As usual, I tried to lighten the mood, joking about the storm and offering everyone some tea. But neither Jason nor Danny responded. They seemed to occupy opposite corners of the room, avoiding direct contact. I felt out of place, as if I had suddenly become an unwelcome element in this unclear situation. I noticed that Danny barely looked at Jason, his eyes fixed on the floor, though sometimes I caught his gaze, and it was still persistent. When night came, I went to the kitchen to make tea before bed. And there, once again, I encountered Danny. He was sitting at the table, slowly stirring a warm drink in his cup. When he saw me, he lifted his eyes and gave a slight smile, his face suddenly soft and calm. It seemed as though this meeting was not by chance, but something in his gaze left a heavy aftertaste in me. "Is everything all right?" I asked, but couldn't help noticing how his words touched me with an unusual ease. "You always try to be kind," he said, and there was a strange warmth in his voice that immediately enveloped me. "Why?" "It's not necessary." His words didn't leave me indifferent. I felt them penetrate deep, making me question what I was doing wrong. My kindness. As if it had never been enough for me, as if I didn't even know why I always tried to be this way. I couldn't help but feel a slight bewilderment, but something in his tone wouldn't let me look away, wouldn't let me leave. The morning began just like all the others. I stood by the stove brewing coffee, thinking about how I should spend the day, trying not to dwell on Danny's strange behavior from the night before. However, When I walked into the kitchen to pour myself a cup of coffee, I saw that Danny was already sitting at the table, as if he'd been there all night. He was alone, just as I usually was at this time, but his presence now seemed unexpected and slightly foreign. At first, I didn't understand what was wrong. He sat silently, staring out the window, and on his face was that familiar but foreign smile that now seemed a bit strained. I sat down next to him, trying to settle into the rhythm of the morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had stopped being just my husband's brother. He had become something more than the person I had known before. Suddenly, Danny pulled out his phone and began scrolling through photos. I noticed that his face became much more focused, almost serious. He showed me one, then another, deeper, more powerful images, landscapes, people, moments, but there was something in these photos that made me uneasy. Their beauty wasn't just visual, there was something more hidden within them. These were photographs that seemed alien to everyday life, a perspective that rarely turned inward. His words about photography being a gaze we rarely give ourselves made me pause. "The world is a little different when you look from the other side," he said, and his statement felt like it had just cut the ground out from under my feet. There was something strangely familiar in those words. I felt the boundaries of my world beginning to shift, as if I wasn't in my own body. In his eyes was such an earnest, almost childlike fascination with what he was seeing that it made me feel slightly uncomfortable. I couldn't help but notice that he was looking at me as though I were something new, something that required attention, something to be explored. We sat there, silently, until I felt our gazes meet. It was a quiet, invisible tension that I couldn't even explain to myself, as if with each passing moment he was becoming more and more the center of my world, and I in turn was beginning to feel like a part of his. The day dragged on slowly, almost unchanged, but it seemed to grow increasingly filled with a tension that was hard to ignore. Danny remained in the house, and I couldn't understand what had shifted within me, but everything now felt different. I noticed his gaze, his presence even in the most mundane moments, the ones I had once overlooked. In the evening, when Danny and I were alone in the kitchen, preparing dinner, I felt the air around us become thick and charged. We were making the same dish, but every movement we made felt somehow particularly deliberate. I handed him the knife, and when our hands barely brushed against each other, I felt a strange jolt. It was such an insignificant moment, merely the passing of a knife, but as it turned out, it left an impression that lingered in me for a long time. I felt something invisible pierce through me, like an electric shock that coursed through my whole body. Danny noticed it, but didn't say a word. He simply continued slicing the vegetables, his hands moving calmly and steadily. I tried to return to the usual atmosphere, smiling and saying something about how much I enjoyed cooking with him, but in response, he merely raised the corners of his lips slightly and continued working. His silence had a weight to it, as though his attention was focused on something bigger than just dinner. We finished cooking, and I began setting the table, but even when we sat down to eat, I still felt his presence, as if something was shifting in the air, heavy, like something inevitable was on the verge of happening. We ate in silence, and the more I tried to engage in conversation, the more I felt his silence becoming a space between us, one in which I was losing myself. He didn't look at me directly, but his gaze was always near, like an invisible magnet, pulling me in, drawing me out. When we finished, I tried to return to my usual state. I needed to somehow continue the day, to make everything stay the same. But inside me, there grew a sense that something had happened, like I had crossed an invisible line without even realizing it. Every glance from Danny, every movement of his, became more and more magnetic, and I couldn't understand what it was about this that made me feel so uneasy. Why did it feel like I could no longer return to my old world? The evening came, and with it, a strange, overwhelming feeling that I could not ignore. I decided I needed to take a walk to clear my mind. Jason went out to the garage to handle his things, leaving Danny and me alone. We walked into the garden, where the rain had calmed down a little, leaving behind the smell of damp earth and freshness. Through the hazy light falling from the window, I could see Danny walking next to me in silence, but his presence seemed to engulf me from all sides. We walked along the path, stepping in the same rhythm, but each step felt louder, as if the world around us had suddenly become too close. I felt his gaze penetrate me without him needing to say a word. He walked a little ahead, and I didn't know what to do, but for some reason, I couldn't step back. Suddenly, when we reached the edge of the garden where the trees bent around the clearing and all that surrounded us was the sound of the remaining raindrops, Danny stopped. He turned to face me, and his eyes were filled with that same strange tension that I couldn't explain. I didn't have time to say anything. He leaned in, his hands touched my face, and his lips gently but firmly pressed against mine. I froze, unable to pull away. It was a quick kiss, but it was so full, so unexpected, that I felt the whole world around us disappear. There were no words, no thoughts, just this moment, which seemed to fill all the space between us. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was empty. I couldn't resist. I couldn't and didn't want to. It was too powerful, too intense. Everything I had ever known was crumbling right before me, and the only thing that remained was the feeling of that kiss, his lips, his breath. When he pulled away, I stood there, stunned, trying to regain control. My lips were trembling, and I could feel a strange mix of shame and desire sweeping over me. I quickly stepped back, trying to justify myself, but he just silently looked at me. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a firm understanding that there was no going back. We both knew something had changed, and now it was beyond our ability to stop it. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there, as though everything that had happened was part of some inevitable path. I turned and walked back toward the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had already taken a step into a new, unfamiliar world. My mind screamed that this was a mistake, but inside me, a storm was raging that couldn't be silenced. The morning after that kiss, everything in the house had changed. The tension hanging in the air was impossible to ignore, like a thunderstorm cloud ready to burst at any moment. I could feel how every glance, every gesture, had become heavier, unnaturally sharp. Jason had already noticed that something was wrong between us, though he remained silent, not showing any obvious displeasure. He was quiet and on edge, which couldn't help but stand out. I felt his gaze piercing through me, sideways, at moments when I thought no one was watching. I tried to hide my discomfort, pretending that nothing had changed, but Danny, sitting at the table, seemed to notice nothing and continued to behave as he always did, calm and at ease. But with that gaze, I noticed that recently he had become more silent, more focused. He was there, but it wasn't just a physical presence. It was like a shadow that followed you even in the brightest moments. Jason spoke to me, but I felt like his words just bounced off me. We exchanged phrases that felt empty, lifeless, like long-forgotten lines. I knew he felt something, understood something, and that feeling became even more palpable. He didn't ask, didn't demand explanations, but I knew that in his silence lay everything he was missing to understand what was happening between me and his brother. When Danny and I were alone, I felt everything inside me freeze. He stood in the doorway, silently watching me. His gaze was cold and almost merciless, as if he already knew what I would feel. He said he couldn't hide it anymore, that we couldn't go on pretending nothing had happened. His words broke that fragile balance I had been trying to maintain. I knew everything had changed, but I couldn't accept it. We both knew our lives would never be the same again. I tried to run, to turn away, but he came closer again, softly but firmly. And in his voice, I heard the same force that had been in that kiss. He repeated, "We can't keep ignoring this. It's more than just an accident." My lips went numb, and I tried to find words, but nothing came out. His proximity was becoming unbearable. I felt my internal barriers collapsing, losing control of myself. He didn't wait for an answer. He simply stood there, and his presence felt increasingly inevitable. I glanced to the side, hoping to find some escape, some way to put everything back in its place, but all I saw was emptiness. I could no longer stop myself. Several days passed, and everything became even more tense than before. The house was filled with silence, the loudest of all possible sounds. We all tried to lead a normal life, but every glance, every step, every accidental gesture, everything was imbued with the same unspoken question: what happens next? Jason became more withdrawn, almost distant. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me, as if reading my thoughts. He knew something had changed between Danny and me, but he couldn't understand exactly what. And then, one day, when Jason was in the garage and I was alone, Danny found me again. He entered the room and shut the door behind him. There was something in his eyes that left no doubt. He came closer, but didn't say a word. We stood in that strange silence, and I felt the air around us grow thick. His breath was audible, and I knew that now everything would be decided. "We can't keep ignoring this," he said, his voice low, as if holding back the storm inside him. His words hit me like lightning. Everything inside me froze, and then, unable to hold myself back, I took a step toward him. He embraced me, and I couldn't say that it felt unnatural. On the contrary, it felt entirely logical, natural, as if my whole life had led me to this moment. His hands, his lips, his scent, all became part of me, as if it had always been there, but I hadn't seen it until now. I knew it was a mistake. I knew I was destroying my family, that I was tearing apart everything that had once meant something. I could feel the world I had fought so hard to hold on to slipping away, but in that moment, I didn't feel pain. Instead of pain, I felt something else, an indescribable relief. I surrendered to that feeling, and everything that had come before seemed to vanish, dissolve. He wasn't in a hurry. He was patient, as if he knew that I needed to understand exactly at this moment. He told me he loved me, and I couldn't say that it wasn't true. It was true, even though I knew it shouldn't be. But now it had become part of me. We didn't say much. We were simply together, and at that moment everything became clear. Everything I had feared, everything I had tried to hide, became obvious. I understood that everything would change, and nothing would ever be the same. When he left, I was alone, with a heavy heart, which nevertheless could not deny that this was the very connection that had existed between us, forbidden, dangerous, but strong. And I could no longer turn away. When Jason found us in the garden, everything became clear. We were sitting in the very spot where the rain had fallen just a few days ago, and it once again enveloped us with its silent presence. But now, it was something more than just rain. It was the sky that had opened up, and all the clouds that had hidden the truth had finally dissolved. I could see how his gaze froze, how he understood everything even before I could say anything. He didn't shout, he didn't demand explanations. He simply stood there, looking at us. It was a silence that spoke louder than any words. He didn't ask, because everything had already been said. He knew. We all knew. I felt the ground slip away from beneath my feet. It wasn't just guilt. It was the destruction of everything I had ever built. I had destroyed a family. I had destroyed his trust. And now, with him gone, leaving me alone with this unbearable choice, I understood that nothing would ever go back to the way it was. No words, no excuses could change what had happened. Danny didn't say a word. He stood by, but I knew that everything between us had already changed. We couldn't go back to what we had before. What had started as a forbidden connection had now become something inevitable. He didn't try to persuade me, didn't attempt to stop me. He was simply there, as though he knew I had already made my decision. And in that silence, in that acceptance, there was something far more terrifying than any words. I was left alone in the empty house. Empty, not just physically, but emotionally. I knew I couldn't go back to my old life. I had destroyed everything that was dear to me, but now, before me stood the question, who am I now? Who am I if I have lost everything I once had? Danny left, leaving me alone with this heavy emptiness. But now I knew I couldn't escape from it. This was not just a decision, it was both an end and a beginning. And despite all the pain and emptiness, I felt something changing inside me, something that would never return. Maybe I had destroyed my life. Maybe I had destroyed my family. But I was no longer the person I once was. And, despite all the uncertainty about what lay ahead, I knew one thing. I couldn't turn back anymore.